Welcome! In this video we will look at modal and modaless forms with the PowerBasic Windows compiler. In previous videos we have looked exclusively at modal dialogs. These are dialogs that are shown to a user, and the application then waits for the user to perform certain events like clicking on buttons, clicking on drop-down lists, and the callback function, which is the event handler, would then react and perform other functions in the background. What we're going to look at today is the use of a Modeless dialog. What we have on screen here is a small, simple application to display a grid on the screen. If we run this now, we will see there's a quite simple list view showing on screen and an exit button. Clicking on the exit button will activate the event in the callback function to close the dialog. However, this is fine when the information comes up on the screen immediately to the user. If we can imagine that the information that's appearing on this screen is coming from some remote server, which takes a few seconds to generate the information to send back to your application. This way, the user may be waiting several seconds before the information comes up. We can simulate that in our code. If we have a look at the event handler for the dialog. In here, there is an initialization section. This is where code will be executed when the form is being initialized, but before it's actually displayed to the user. We can put an artificial delay in here to simulate a delay of information coming back from a server. If we put a sleep of 5,000 milliseconds, 5 seconds, then the form will be delayed coming on screen by 5 seconds. So if we run the code now, despite having run the code, nothing is appearing on screen, and won't for 5 seconds. And now it appears. However, if the database you're pulling this information from can take longer than 5 seconds, say for example 10 or 15 seconds to gather the information, the user will be sitting looking at a blank screen for that length of time. At that point, of course, the user would start to wonder, did I actually click on the button? Has something gone wrong with the application? So normally in these situations, where there's a significant delay to information appearing on a user's screen, you would want to display something to the user to let them know that all is well and the program is still running, and it's merely waiting for information coming back. Generally, these are referred to as splash screens. Many games programs display splash screens at the beginning because there's a lot of information being handled in the background, and this can take a significant amount of time before the user can then use the application. So how can we display a splash screen on the user without interfering with the application's tasks in the background? We're going to do this by the creation of a small splash screen. If we go into our PowerBasic forms, we can see this is the single screen this application currently has. We're going to create a new screen, a very small splash screen, and if we look at the properties of the form, we will go in and we will change a few of these dialog properties. Now, it doesn't need a border or a dialog frame. What we will do is we will untick the modal frame and we will center it on the screen. So if you test that dialog at the moment, it would come up just as a grey box. This is just what we're after. So we will put some text on the screen to say that it's loading. And we will make it large enough so that the user can actually see it. That's a reasonable size. Now we can also center that on the screen. And we will change the size of the dialog. And we will put a color in the background. And we will change the foreground color as well. So if we test this now, this is what it would display on the screen. A very basic and non-animated loading screen. So if we save that, and we've called this dialog 2, so there will now be a dialog 2 on our list. So if we have a look at the coding behind dialog 2, we can see this is a fairly standard layout of a new dialog. It's a dialog new command. We're giving it the title, in which case we're not displaying the title. We're giving it a location on screen, and it's decided to make this a modal dialog. Now, when you launch a modal dialog, the dialog will display on screen and wait for the user to perform some action. Any code following the call to show the dialog will not be executed until the dialog actually completes. Now, this is not what we want for a splash screen. We want the splash screen to display on screen and for the application to continue loading its data. So we're going to change this from modal to modeless. So having done that, we can then call the dialog right at the beginning of the code. If we look in our PB main function, where our first dialog is called, if we put a call in to the second dialog first, we can display the splash screen before we display the main screen. However, what we'll want to do is, once the information has actually loaded in the dialog 1, we want to close down the splash screen. We don't want it to remain on screen. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to capture the handle of that particular dialog. In here we're using HDLG as a local variable. Now we want to create a global variable to handle our dialog. So we will create a global at the beginning of our code, and we'll mark it as a global. And when our dialog actually gets shown, before we actually display it, we will store the value of HDLG into the global variable. And having done that, in our event handler, our callback function of the first dialog, after the sleep, which is simulating the loading of the data, we can actually close down that dialog. So what should happen is the application should load, the initial dialog splash screen should display, it should then go on to call the dialog 1, it should sleep for 5 seconds, then after 5 seconds it should close down the splash screen and then continue to display the dialog. So if we try running that now, our dialog comes up to say it's loading. This should remain on the screen for 5 seconds, and as soon as it's finished, the main dialog should display. Now, the other thing we may want to do is to make sure that our dialog splash screen is the topmost dialog, to make sure that no other dialog appears on top of it. So if we have a look at our styles, we can actually click on this one for WSEX topmost to make sure that it's above all other dialogs. So if we save that now, and we run our code, then we'll see that regardless of which dialogs you move around, nothing will appear in front of that dialog. And once the main dialog loads, this splash screen has disappeared. So this is a very simple splash screen using a modeless dialog. You can of course do more with modeless dialogs, and you can indeed have several of them on the screen at the same time, if you wish to display perhaps 3 separate windows with different information all being updated concurrently. But this has been a short introduction to modeless dialogs. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.